Here we are at week 4 of 6 of our class on the quality of attention. And this week's topic is attention to karma. A really big topic. But I will go ahead and try to give just a brief recap of the Dhamma talk from this week. And then we can open it up to any kind of comments or questions you might have. So I began by saying that perhaps over the last week or so, since our topic, I'll just make sure that everybody's mic is muted. Since last week's topic was attention to mind, that perhaps something that's coming up for you now, having observed mind a bit, is how to make sense of all this. What is actually going on here? And in order to bring some wisdom to that, I shared the poem from Mita Kali Bhikkhuni, from one of the awakened women of the Buddha's time. And her poem is from this. This is a rendering, a very, very contemporary rendering of poetry, the poetry of the Terries. And it's called The First Free Women. And there are many, many translations of this into English and into other languages by other folks, particularly Susan Murcott is another interesting one to have a look at. But in any event, not to get too far afield, so Mita Kali Bhikkhuni, friend of the dark, and she starts out by telling us a little bit about her aspiration to become smarter by being a practitioner, and how that shifted when she began having the experience of watching her thoughts building a house and then filling up that house and creating a whole world, many houses. And how she then relinquished those thoughts, even the beautiful thoughts. She says, who will look after you after I'm gone? And so just to say briefly that the metaphor that she's using here, and perhaps knowingly, but I don't know, it could have been just her describing her experience in a similar way, but it sounds very much like a verse from the Dhammapada, which is understood to be one of the first things that the Buddha thought and said shortly after his enlightenment, his own enlightenment. About the house builder, seeing the house builder and knowing that the house would never be built again. That the so-called ridgepole, the main support for building a structure, had been broken. And so for that, we looked a little bit at Gil Fronsdal's version of the Dhammapada. But the metaphor is basically something along the lines of house representing the sense of self, the sense of identity, the walls that we put between ourselves and our environment, our experience, the whole world, and fill up that house with things with which we are identified. And the builder is understood, could be understood perhaps to be the ignorant mind, the mind that does not understand that construction process or understand how that process leads again and again to dukkha. And so looking at it from that standpoint, from the standpoint of how that process of construction happened, then I brought in a little bit of the 12-fold chain, the 12 links in the chain of causation. which is a very complex teaching. It's impossible to, we could do a whole class on the 12-fold chain and probably not cover it all. But nonetheless, touched a little bit on this process of ignorant mind leading to volitional actions that then create this impetus, this momentum of karma working itself out in the form of dukkha, or alternatively, looking at the way that it could lead toward liberation, following the 7 factors of liberation. And there's a little graphic about that you might remember. You could have a look at that if you have further questions, which might be the case. But just to also say that the 12 links can be understood as representing 3 different lifetimes, how the previous lifetime to this one created this karmic momentum. And then we come into this lifetime and we also add to that karmic momentum by what we do with our actions of body, speech, and mind in a lifetime. And then at the end of this lifetime, that momentum again continues so it's moving, it's shifting all this time, continues and expresses itself as the next lifetime. That's one way of understanding the 12-fold chain, the 12 links, as describing 3 lifetimes. Or another way of understanding it is as moment to moment. So the way of understanding the 12 links as a moment to moment process is basically describing how we are conditioned. How we are conditioned by what came before, by the energy, the momentum of that way of thinking, of doing, of speaking, and how that leads into the next moment. And the principle behind all of this, the 12 links, is the principle of karma. So if you read the part of the article or the entire article by Bhante Piyadasi, and I have to apologize for the extreme masculinity of the language that Bhante Piyadasi likes to use. But if you read that article, then you saw that he brings up karma numerous times in terms of the driving principle, and particularly places where that momentum is shifting, again, from a lifetime to a lifetime, or from a moment to a moment. And just to say again, so karma is our main topic today. Karma, the word itself, that's the Pali word is karma, 2 M's, and the Sanskrit word is karma, with an R, so it might be more familiar to most people. Many people in the States now, that's a sort of mainstream word. And the word literally means action. Action. And I think of it sometimes as being like gravity. It's a principle. It's not a thing that we can see particularly, but it is a principle whose effects we can see. And it arises based on various causes and conditions. It arises among causes and conditions. And karma is the principle or the momentum or the activity of how our actions have a consequence based on whether they are skillful or unskillful or neutral. So according to the Buddha's way of understanding the world, the entire universe has a sort of moral principle that's playing itself out in the form of karmic consequences. And the consequences are called vipaka, the results. And not everything in your life is a result. There are many things which are not, but there are many things that are resultants. And it's complex to figure out, because the Buddha, in fact, said that a complete understanding of karma is impossible. It's one of the 4 imponderables. One of the things that he said would lead only to vexation if you tried to understand it completely and in detail. And even he, when he described karmic consequences, people would ask him, well, where's that person going after their death? Or what's the result of XYZ practice that they're doing, many different types of ascetic practice or seekers or household practice. And he would reply in terms of a variety of outcomes. Well, if it's fully cultivated, it's like this, or if there's this other factor, it's like that, or perhaps it's not completed in this lifetime, and then it's like so, and he would give various possibilities. So even a Buddha does not completely conceive of karma clearly. But he did explain to us that it had a number of factors, and I shared with you, I hope you all had a quick look at the video of breaking the rack. So each and every action is not the cue ball. So now I'm talking about billiards. And again, hopefully everybody had a chance to take a look at the video. And if not, you can go back to the page and have a look. It's not that the cue ball just hits one other ball. Each time you do an action or you say something or you think something volitional, then it's like hitting the whole rack of balls with the cue ball and they go flying. So there's a sequence, there's a whole set of consequences and interactions that are happening. And just even thinking about that way of envisioning what karma is like, then you could automatically see how inconceivable even a single human life would be in terms of that set of karmic consequences. But nonetheless, we do talk about it. We do have various pointers from the Buddha about which karma leads to liberation and to freedom and to peace of mind, and which types of karma lead to greater suffering. The precepts in various schools of Buddhism are one example of that, of the Buddha saying these are the kinds of things that lead to less suffering and greater peace of mind and more freedom. And then we looked at the sutta, which was really the linchpin for me, the kind of impetus for me to offer this class, because I think it points exactly to this concept of the quality of mind as the determinant of our experience of the world, rather than the content of what we experience, but the quality of mind that we bring to it. So I looked a little bit at a sutta called Nutriment, Samyutta Nikaya 46, chapter 46, number 51. And it is a sutta that describes the things that nourish the arising of the hindrances, or quote unquote starve or reduce the arising of the hindrances, and the activities or the attention, the forms of working with the mind that augment the 7 awakening factors or that starve the 7 awakening factors. And in particular, there was one juxtaposition that I pointed out that I think is very helpful for us to look at, and that is the Buddha saying that frequent unwise attention to the repulsive, or that which is likely to lead to a sense of aversion, creates ill will. It creates anger in the mind. One of the poisons, actually, ill will, right? Greed, hatred, or anger, or ill will, and delusion, one of the 3 main poisons. But later on in the same sutta, he says, frequent wise attention to what? To the asubha, to that which is foul and nasty and difficult, actually decreases our tendency to be pulled into sense desire as a way of trying to solve our problems. So it's a wise thing that it gives us, it cools off some of the heat, some of the tendency to be driven by our desires. And what is the difference? So these are two, even though these are two different Pali words, they're referring to the repulsive and the foul, right? So these very difficult negative things to be with, to experience. And yet the Buddha is very clearly saying, wise attention, helpful. Unwise attention, unhelpful. It's your choice. It's your choice. And that word, the phrase that's being translated, I'll stop in just a moment, but I just want to wrap up the recap by saying that that phrase that is being translated as frequent wise attention is a beautiful one. It's yoniso manasikara. And as I said in the talk, yoniso is related, the etymology of that word is related to the same word for the womb, for a woman's womb. And manasikara is this word that is being translated as attention. So mind, attention. Mana is mind. A kind of mind directedness, literally speaking, is how that Pali word parses out. So it's a kind of attention to the real source of things, the origins of things, the not being swept away by the superficial, perhaps, but a deeper kind of attention. So with that, I'm going to open up the conversation to comments and questions. And I think maybe the way we'll do it is as we did before, which is you can just raise your hand and unmute yourselves as I call on you, and then we'll see how we do. Surely there must be some questions. This is some of the most complicated material in the class. Yes, Sue, please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, now you're muted.
Beautiful teaching. I found the sutta just remarkable. I thought I was having restlessness, and it was actually doubt. And the antidote, I guess, is that another term?
Mm-hmm.
The antidote to doubt. I just spent really kind of hours exploring that. So I'm just really grateful for how you set it up and explained it. So thank you so much. Could not figure out though what a sign of non-dispersal was. So.
Well, so let's just say for the sake of everybody else listening, so the antidote to doubt, which Sue didn't mention, is investigation. So actually checking out the Dhamma. Does it really work or does it not? Is it really as the Buddha says it is, or is it not? That is the key antidote to doubt that the Buddha points to. As for the sign of non-dispersal, so this can be taken a couple of ways, or many more, but certainly a couple of ways. One is, it's a technical term which refers to the nimittas. So nimittas, when we're talking about jhana states or samadhi states, kinds of, deeper concentration states of great stillness of the mind, are often preceded by nimitta or signs. And the sign of non-dispersal would mean that there is a point in the mind preparing for these very still states in which it literally sort of withdraws from the senses. It withdraws from hearing things that you perceive to be outside of you, for example, or being conscious of other people in the room, or these kinds of, sort of sense indicators, even subtle ones that we're tracking most of the time. And instead of that, which is a kind of dispersal, right? It's a kind of going out. It's a way that the attention is directed externally. Even if your eyes are closed and you're listening to your breath or other things, there's this kind of attention also happening externally. So the sign of non-dispersal is often that. It's a sense of a literal, it, yeah, I suppose you could say a literal withdrawing from that way of tracking things outside, such that the mind is then really much more focused on itself, on the inner experience, and not inner like feeling the inside of your body either, but inner experience. That's one way to take it as a technical term. The other way to take it is something like just noticing that there is an aspect of some part of the mind that is willing to watch, that's just willing to be present for the stuff that's going on. So sometimes a metaphor or a way that I think about this, or I talk to people about this, is like if thoughts are like the radio playing, then a sign of non-dispersal would be when you notice that there is a mind that's just aware of the radio playing and not sort of sucked into what the radio is saying or what the music is, or arguing with the radio or singing along with the radio, but just present in the same room with the radio, so to speak. That would also be a sign of non-dispersal, right? Like you're not trying to follow along, sing along. There's just some part that's steady. Okay, great, wonderful that you found your doubt. Yeah, sadhu. Yeah. Great. Okay. Yes. Let's see, Susan, and then Emily.
So my question is about consciousness.
Uh-huh.
And I think even last week, I was left with a kind of fuzziness around the khandha or skandha of consciousness. And then it appears again in the 12 links, right? So I think one of the things I think I'm getting tripped up on, and maybe it's just too conceptual, but is the relationship between consciousness and awareness. And I think it's because I think of the practice of mindfulness and in general to be focused on being aware of what's really going on. And I think I have a positive spin on that. So what's the relationship between, I don't even know what I'm asking, but what is consciousness and what is the relationship between consciousness and awareness, I guess.
Okay. So consciousness is the question about consciousness is a big one. And actually, Yadasi addresses it in various ways in his article, which I think also can lead to some confusion because he's pointing at it in different ways within the 12 links. And that's because there are within the Buddhist teachings different descriptions of what is meant by consciousness, right? So there is a way that you can equate consciousness and awareness, right? So if consciousness, as we understand it in the 5 khandhas, for example, the 5th khandha, vijnana, that is just the receptive awareness, the thing which is literally receiving the information of contact that the sense organ and the sense object meeting. There has to be some awareness of that, some receptivity to that in order for a contact to happen, right? So that kind of consciousness is just the bare awareness that is present before any kind of activity happening at all. And so that actually is pretty close to the consciousness that we see in the 12-fold chain, right? Consciousness happening before Namarupa, before the identity of a human being. That's what Namarupa is, kind of shorthand for human being. Human being that has an identity. It means name and form. Name, right? This Susan Priest. That's your nama. That's one way that we know your nama. Okay? And your form, your physical form. So in the 12-fold chain, that kind of consciousness also is pretty close to just a very bare, open, receptive awareness that then becomes the receptacle, if you will, or the sky in which thoughts and you know, physical sensations and all kinds of stuff start arising. The complication gets in that we then start to see that the Buddha then says, well, what arises out of that threefold point of contact is a moment of ear consciousness, for example. So then the way that I interpret that, and I've seen various people interpret it different ways, so you don't have to take my way for it, but the way that I interpret that is to say, it's like a particular color of the sky, right? So there's this huge sky in which thoughts are happening and sense perceptions are happening, and maybe the sky is blue at that moment because it's the ear consciousness that's predominant. Do you see what I'm saying? Like it has a flavor or a color, or if we think of consciousness, and this is the other complication, that consciousness very much the way that it's described in the suttas could be seen as, like we understand in physics, like a light. You can describe it as particles, as little individual moments, right? That's one way of saying it. So there's this contact moment, blink, and that's one particle of the stream of consciousness. Or you can describe it as a wave, right? As a continuous, we experience it, I think, most of the time as human beings. We typically experience it more like that, with a kind of sense of continuity to it. And then it's more like, okay, so this is a wave of ear consciousness, and that next moment might be a wave of, you know, smell consciousness, and that, like so. So then I just gave you several different ways to think about it, but that's where we get into a little bit more complexity, is what's included in consciousness, right? The bigger picture of consciousness means all of it is then there. Like the way a sensation is, there's the receptive part, but then that receptive part gets colored in some way by receiving a sound contact. So it's all included in there, in other words. Yeah, that's it. Woo! And then it gets huge. And that's also part of the reason why, you know, some people have divided up. There's a particular Tibetan tradition in which they talk about the 20-something consciousnesses and so on. You know, there are ways that you could divide it up into umpteen pieces. And my experience hasn't been so favorable with that. I think it's much more important for us to sit in the midst of what we experience as consciousness and inquire into it, right? And inquire into it. And maybe then we start to see, oh, so then this moment of ear consciousness feels like this, and it has a distinct flavor then, like a touch consciousness. For me, you know, this is where I said also, like, if you're a visual learner, you know that that consciousness, for whatever reason, tends to be more present for you. Why? We don't know why, because you just happen to like that particular flavor. But if I'm an auditory learner, right, and I receive a visual teaching, then, oh, maybe that flavor is harder for me to take in, because that's just the tendency of my particular consciousness. So it's not a blank slate either. It's very clear. It's also very clear in the way that it's taught in the 12-fold chain, that it's not a blank slate. It's equally a conditioned thing. Equally a conditioned thing, just as much as this body is, just as much as all the aspects of our lives. So we'll give you that to chew on for a while. But unless you have a follow-up question.
Well, I know, I think that it's just so vast.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's actually the conditioned aspect of consciousness that I'm a little, I don't know how to, I don't think I've had an experience of that, because my felt sense is that consciousness is before, during, and after, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I'm realizing as you were speaking, and I was thinking about all these connections, that I don't have an experience of it, the conditioned nature of consciousness.
Yes, yes. And that's really hard. It's very difficult, very, very subtle thing to experience. And I would add that this is one of the reasons also why Bhante mentions very clearly in the article that consciousness is not continuous. So it's not the same thing as our karmic stream. This is a very common point of confusion. That because we have consciousness our entire lives, we think, oh, and that's what continues, and then there's another being, and it's just a continuation of this consciousness. No, that's not the traditional way of understanding it. The traditional way of understanding it is that consciousness dies out at some point after the death of the body. Either immediately, or sometimes there's a delay of some days. Or in some traditions, like in the Zen tradition, there's even the understanding that it could be delayed weeks. But in any event, at some point, that consciousness, that flame goes out, that consciousness goes out. But that karmic stream continues, and then it needs to express itself again. And that's where, again, consciousness comes up before the Namarupa. Yeah. It's big. Okay, Emily.
Hello, thank you, Venerable Dhammadipa, for all these teachings. Really grateful to be in this class. So nice to see everybody. I think I have two questions that are related. One is, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the karmic consequences under which one is operating, and where there is space for the choice and responsibility. Because on one level, my brain keeps wanting to say, well, it's all conditioned, and so where do I get to, or the extent to which I can exercise frequent wise attention is completely determined by the conditions under which I'm already operating, if that makes sense as the way I'm thinking. And then the other one is that when I'm talking with other people about karma, actually I almost never do, because I feel like I need to be so wary how I talk about it, because it's so easy for it to be interpreted that there's some kind of blame or punishment involved in the way that people are experiencing, again, their karmic consequences. And yeah, I'm sure you understand the question, so I'll leave it at that, but thank you.
Okay. So let's talk about the first part. So this is the short answer is this, that the teaching of karma is very strongly affirming the efficacy of action, of intention. If it were not so, then we would be like the Jains, for example, who believed that karmic consequences were being created even by accidental things that we do. So like if you accidentally step on an ant, that would have equal amount of karmic, at least as I understand it. I'm not a Jain, so I can't speak perfectly for them, but as I have understood it, as I've been taught, to the Jains, accidentally stepping on an ant and killing it would have equal karmic consequence as intentionally stepping on an ant and killing it. Versus the Buddha said quite clearly, according to the records that we have, that isn't the case. That there isn't a karmic consequence to an accidental action. But an intentional action does have one. And so there's definitely the efficacy of action. And in fact, the efficacy of action is one of the key, there are two key factors in right view. One of them is that. Believing that what you do and say and think matters. And then secondly, the Four Noble Truths. Because in fact, you cannot be on the path unless there's some way for you to make a difference, right? Otherwise, it's a deterministic view and you're just stuck doing what you're doing. That said, so the karma of past is influencing us, though. Those karmic results are arising in the course of our lives. But as I said before, not everything in our life is a karmic result. Not everything. And the Buddha also very, very clearly said, what we do in this lifetime is also affecting our karma. So practicing, for example, and let's say this is a very good example. So if you did something as a child that you feel bad about, and then later on you begin to practice and you realize, oh, that was a harmful thing that I did and I feel some remorse about it, then that has an effect on the karmic result that will come out of that. And it could be that that thing that you did was in part set up by some of the consequences from your previous life. You see what I'm saying? So you're in effect sort of mitigating even by having remorse about it, even the consequence from something that happened before that you can't be conscious of. So it's a very complex cocktail, right, that's happening. And so our intention, the things that we choose to do, are adding conditions into the mix. That's the way to really think about it. We don't have absolute ability to determine, because those results are happening, and karma is, I promise you, at least in my life's experience, inexorable. Karma is going to work itself out. But as that process is happening, we're adding further conditions into the mix, into that stream, right? And so that stream is also shifting literally from moment to moment. That stream of karmic momentum is shifting from moment to moment. Okay? And that's what wants to take expression, if you believe in the rebirth process, that's what wants to take expression after we die. That momentum of the consequences and the effects wanting to arise in a particular way. So if you did a lot of things that lead to a wholesome arising, then after rebirth, then there's this wanting to take a life, right? For a life to arise that will allow those wholesome consequences to be there, be present. But even so, then that life arises in the midst of a whole world of other conditions that are happening. So maybe there's a volcano, and then you die because there's a volcano, and you die young because there's a volcano, and well, that's a karmically neutral event. It's happened because of the physical conditions in your world, but not because, at least again, as I understand the Buddha to have taught it, not because of something that you did previously. But it does mean that the karma of that lifetime then is done in some way. It was completed. Whatever karma needed to express itself in that lifetime, then it's done, and it goes on to the next part. Then it continues to resolve itself. So that is also part of the answer to the question about the blaming part. So I'm sorry to say that as long as we believe that there is a self, a solid self, and in fact a self that moves on like being poured from one cup into the next, then karma is going to sound like blaming the victim, right? But if you understand that there's this one being and that one being dies, but there's an energy that needs to express itself, and then a new being then has those effects, some of those effects play out, and they contribute their thing. Then it's clear also, right? Like it's not, is it the same person? No, it's not the same person as the one before that's experiencing the effect. Is it completely unrelated and random and independent of the thing before? Well, no, because there's this stream that tends to kind of hang together. But in the same way that I wouldn't look at a slice of the river, right? I wouldn't look at one slice of the river and say, this slice of the river is being punished because of that slice of the river up here. It just flows. There's this set of molecules here, and the river flows, and then there's that set of molecules in a different constellation over here. But a constellation that kind of makes sense because of this principle. It's not random. Is that helping at all?
Yes, it is. Although, of course, also the negative karmic results can play out within the same lifetime.
Really?
Thinking about, I think you mentioned Angulimala with the fingers and the murdering, and he had all sorts of terrible things happen to him after he'd been enlightened, as I understand it, in the same body. They all happened, but it's the same principle, right? That he's not a self, so it's not blaming. It's just, it has to be played out, has to. But I'm wondering whether, does that mean it's not very skillful to talk about karma with people who don't have that understanding, at least as a theoretical construct, because they can't help it hear it that way? And that's my last question, but I did want to follow up with that.
I don't know. I mean, I think if you can talk about karma as being like gravity, and people can sort of make that leap to it as a principle, as being literally like a principle of the universe, like gravity, or like, you know, quantum mechanics, or whatever scientific thing they might be okay with, then you could go there. Then you could kind of you know what I'm saying? Then you could understand it. But I think yeah, it is for some people it's very comforting, the idea that there is a moral valence to what we do, and for other people it's very scary, no matter how they understand it, you know. Hey Chris, sure, please ask your question.
Sorry, took me a minute to unmute. So maybe I'll ask a follow-up, just kind of keep in the same discussion line. So the part that I was struggling this week, and really I haven't spent much time thinking about karma prior to this week, so it is kind of a new interpretation, right? But it comes from the fact that, you know, the Buddha basically said, come and see. Like everything I'm teaching you, you can sort of see for yourself in your body, heart, and mind. And this is one I'm trying to figure out, like, what is the practical way to see it? So if it's imponderable, and if it can flow through multiple lifetimes, I'm trying to figure out how you can practically orient yourself towards karma. Whereas, so for example, I see the 5 precepts more as fundamentally related to not creating suffering for other beings, compassion, view of life. But when you add this karma stream to it, it almost seems like more you need to now start taking things at faith, which everything up to this point is like, oh, I can sort of test this for myself.
Mm.
So I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that is described very commonly of people who have deeper meditation states is that they can see their past lives. One or more of their past lives. And the Buddha said that on the night of his awakening that he saw like 1,000 of his past lives. And again, are they his exactly? Well, we have to speak about it somehow. They're not exactly his, right? So from that standpoint, I would say some people might say you can see it very clearly in that way. If you're not seeing it in that way, which I think is the vast majority, I think the question that we can ask ourselves is, how do we understand the cause and effect that's happening in this lifetime? Right? How is it that you can experience the cause and effect that's happening in this lifetime? And I will say that that leads us back to the way of looking at the 12 links as a moment to moment, right? As a moment to moment. And I think that leads us actually all the way back to a little bit of what Susan was asking. What is the nature of consciousness and how is consciousness conditioned? So I should also maybe make a clarification at this point that when we say, in Buddhism, when we say that something is conditioned, I don't mean it in the psychological sense. I don't mean it like Pavlov's dog, that if you get yelled at always for saying the F word as a child, that you then later on in life feel anxiety when you say the F word or when somebody else says the F word, okay? Or whatever thing it is. I'm just using a trivial example, but I don't mean that kind of psychological conditioning. When we say conditioned in Buddhism, it typically means, and we're going to look more at this next week, I think, in the class on emptiness. What it means is that it is dependent for its arising on the set of conditions that make it possible. So that's why I say, so when it comes to checking out karma for yourself, you have to ask yourself, what is the set of conditions that makes this situation, this consciousness, this life possible right here, right now? And if you study that, then you might find yourself looking at those 12 links. So yeah, that's as pretty much as detailed as I think I'm going to be able to get there. But it is a deep question, and I will tell you that one of the things that that people struggle with at end of life oftentimes when they're trying to find meaning is this question. whether they're Buddhist or not, Also, lots of atheist people or agnostic people or, even Christian people are sort of like, wow, like, did it make a difference that I tried to do good with my life, or that I did terrible things with my life, or did it really make a difference? But yeah.
Yeah, and I guess it's complicated, right? I mean, the billiard example, like, it really resonated with me because that's sort of, in some ways, sort of how I thought about it prior to this week. Is like every action creates this unknown number of infinite reactions, right? Kind of chaos theory like. And anyway, but that was really helpful to like just kind of zero it in a little bit. So thank you.
Okay, good. Hopefully it is helpful. And that will demonstrate, that is also a demonstration of the emptiness of the thing. So that's, just to skip ahead a little bit, because it was actually also touched on in some of our discussion this week. The principle of emptiness is based on conditionality. It's based on us understanding that whatever exists in this moment, whatever state of existence is happening in the entire universe, is the way it is because the conditions are there for it to be that way. So we can't really say it shouldn't be like that. It must be like that because that's how the conditions are. And this goes again also to the question of intentionality and efficacy of action. So if we want it to be different, then we need to contribute the condition of our intentional action of body, speech, and mind into that equation until it gets to the tipping point where it changes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, Shelley.
So isn't one reason that some of us are attracted to Vipassana is because we're trying to shift that momentum? Isn't that the tools? We're learning those tools to make a shift in energy and momentum. And just following ethical practices and refraining to the best of our ability from harming others does make a difference in a flow of energy. Even if we don't understand a lot, we do know that if we've refrained from doing harm, that we're exerting energy in the universe. And we have to, from my point of view, I don't have to understand a lot, except that I've refrained from harming another being. And I do know that's part of the big stream. So with the Vipassana, I was really thinking about Sue's question about dispersal and also about consciousness. And it seems that we don't want to fight against our own ignorance and waste energy on it. Just that slow momentum of the awakening factors helping us along. I really feel encouraged by that. And I really liked that part where Buddha says, don't try to understand the karma. That's another example of hitting your head against an unnecessary wall and wasting energy. Mm-hmm. Just, again, the Eightfold Path is going to help us. And as far as the dispersal, I really imagined another level of consciousness when you're not taking in the things on the outside. Just as meditation improves, that non-dispersal is like going to be, from my point of view, a natural occurrence. So that's just my opinion and my 2 cents. I'm done.
Yes. Well, yeah, so choosing to live an ethical life is something that fosters a kind of clarity of mind. That's how it's typically described in early Buddhism. It fosters a clarity of mind, which, if you just think about it from a perfectly mundane way of it, it's like, sure, you don't have to figure out how to cover up that lie, or who knows about that lie, or what will happen to you if so-and-so figures out about that lie, or if you're going to go to prison over it, or any of those things, right? There's a lot less clutter around that because you didn't do it in the first place. So there's a clarity about things. a clarity to the mind, just in terms of not having to deal with all of the negative consequences that come from unethical action. Even if you feel justified in it, just think about that. Even if you feel justified in telling the lie, there's still all that other stuff that goes with it. You know? So definitely, I think the ethical behavior as a laying the groundwork for more clarity of mind is a good place to start. And yeah, that in terms of the non-dispersal, that is what I was trying to say, which is that the mind will, I like to sometimes think of it as like change the channel to not being attending to anything outside, anything in the perceived outer world, and that is non-dispersal itself. It's like it just pulls itself in, like the turtle pulling in its shell, you know, kind of like it just pulls itself in, and there isn't this kind of stuff out there anymore. And that is a very different than you can imagine, like the turtle pulling itself inside the shell. It's like, oh, then there's a very different perspective from in there, you know, a very different experience, which doesn't have which doesn't have this kind of agenda of understanding necessarily. It's just that understanding comes because it's a knowing, it's a clearer kind of knowing.
Would it also indicate also a non-dispersal of your energy into unnecessary directions? I'm still trying to understand that phrase. You know. Yeah.
The non-dispersal of the karmic energy, you mean, or the non-dispersal of the mental energy?
No, of your conscious energy at any given time.
Right.
Dispersed outwardly. It's
right.
Concentrated inwardly.
Right. And it can be so I guess maybe I'm not sure I'm understanding where your question is there, Shelley, but let me say this. We can do some of that. We can do some of this turning the attention. This was the question in the first class, right? Turning the attention inward. We can do some of that with intention, but there's another way also that's non-intentional, where the mind will do that of its own. The mind just decides that it's not interested in the other stuff. And that's as a result of sort of, I could say it in a kind of funny way. It's as a result of it, you know, like, throwing away boredom. Like staying with the thing long enough that there isn't some judgment about, I don't want to be here, or this is too bland, or anything like that. But like throwing away boredom and staying with the thing until the Vedana is neutral. And then when the Vedana is neutral, it's like, oh, then I don't need to be going out here looking for bubbles of positive or negative things. It's just like, oh, I could hang out here in this very neutral, comfy space.
Well, thank you. That does help. I'm just thinking in terms of our own personal energy and how we direct it through our consciousness and awareness. So you gave me some good ideas. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Olivia.
This is a really complicated topic, and I've really appreciated hearing everyone else's questions. It's like going through my head. Where I am in my understanding, like I have, it's not hard to accept cause and like mundane, cause and effect. And it's not hard to accept or understand that there are sort of general forces of physics and biology and psychology and that they're also karmic forces, and that we can't really separate those out. Like that part works for me. And then what also works for me is the understanding of cause and effect within my lifetime. I can see putting attention on wholesome versus unwholesome, or giving the wrong kind of attention. I can see that we can do those experiments and see the result. So all of that like makes sense. I think I'm understanding it. I think I'm at like a rough like place of the structure is there, and I'm sort of getting it. I guess if we have not seen our past lives, if we have not had those advanced states of consciousness or experience to have seen those, and we're not intended to take rebirth on faith. I don't think we're supposed to just take it on faith. I guess that's sort of the question, like is it enough? Like should I it's sort of a like what should I be focusing on question. Like should I just stay with mundane cause and effect in my own experience, what I have control over, what I can change in this moment in terms of my wholesome or unwholesome thoughts and actions? Or is there also a component here where rebirth and the larger karmic flow needs to be understood better and needs to be explored more?
I think if you find that when you lead a life that is more wholesome, that then you experience the effects of that in your own life, then if that is all there is, would that be enough? Right? That's the question you have to ask yourself. If that's all there is, and the rebirth folks are all confused, then would it be enough that you just led your life in a way that was wholesome and that had enough goodness in it and enough non-harming in it that you could feel okay when you died?
That's interesting. Can I give my response?
Sure.
I feel like, no, that's not enough. Like this one little lifetime is so short and minuscule, and how can that be sufficient good impact? I don't know. Like, what can I do? And then it makes it seem like my life is urgently needs to get much more good, because who knows when you're going to die, and if that's just the end. Or you could go the other direction, nihilistic, and just say, well, it doesn't matter. So I think there is a part of me that is wanting to believe or see that there is a continuation of something, and that it's not just one shot, and that everything that is done in this lifetime, even if it didn't culminate, that's what I'm looking for, in freedom, that it somehow gets passed forward. Like, I like those ideas. I think you said some people feel nervous about karma, some people feel comforted. I think I'm on the comforted side. But I still don't believe it, and like I don't have a direct experience of it, so how do I really believe it? I don't know.
Well, I think you just have to keep practicing with that question. I think you just have to keep at that question. Because what you refer to as mundane cause and effect, I think that also does work, that it's extremely rare that people do very harmful things and don't experience some kind of consequences in this lifetime. Right? So at least we have that going for us. That we see that pretty clearly. And that's a big step. all by itself. You know, there are lots of people causing a lot of self-harm because they haven't even taken that step yet. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shelley, also, just to respond one more bit to Shelley's question, and then we'll go to Michaela, to say perhaps something that goes in the direction of your question about working with the energies would be to think about how is it that you can direct attention, because in that same way you can direct your energies, like bodily energies, mental energies, meditative energies, in that same way, right? So if
Yes.
you learn about the mental intentionality, then those energetic intentionality will come up.
Right. Because investigation and energy are part of the awakening factors.
Yeah,
so that's
exactly.
in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that I have to struggle with sloth and torpor and doubt. And there are days where I go, I don't know where I'm going to get the energy or even the willpower to investigate. To me, that's a huge challenge. So that's, I think, taking responsibility for your own energy as a being and making decisions on how to direct it, whether it's ethical choice or investigative, is just a really big, important thing for me right now.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think it affects your karmic stream. You're part of the whole universe. So you're going to put intention and energy in whatever the flavor.
Yes.
And that's sort of what I was trying to get at earlier.
Yes. Great.
Thank you for coming back.
Yes.
Coming back to me. Yeah, thank you.
I'm glad we got there. And joy, don't forget about joy, right? Remember that Venerable Anelia says, even if you're doing, for example, the 16 steps of breathing, don't just do the first tetrad, do the second tetrad and the first tetrad, because you get the joy part of it.
Well, one of my favorite things that he says is that even when you're feeling like you have a long way to go, sort of, he doesn't put it just that way on the awakening factors. He says, don't miss the opportunity. He puts it a little differently. If you have a moment where you see that you have no hatred, no ill will, no craving, no lust, stop and take that joy. I really think he emphasizes that.
Yes.
Wherever you are in your path.
Yes.
Don't miss that opportunity to feel that kind of joy, that those hindrances are absent. Even if you remember a grudge the next 5 minutes, you've had a moment where it's absent. I liked that part. So thanks for bringing up joy. Yeah.
Great. There you go. Yeah. Okay, Michaela, one last question for the day.
Okay, I'm not sure if we have enough time for that actually now, but I can try and we will see.
Go ahead. Yeah. And then if folks, I want to just say, if folks feel the need to hop off right at the time, we won't be offended, right, Michaela? We will just.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe it's rather a theoretical question, but for me it has a practical aspect for me that I could also use as a follow-up to Olivia's question. And it's something I've been thinking of from the beginning of precept study. So there's this bodhisattva vow, and sometimes it looks to be interpreted like that we vow to be reborn again and again and again. And for me, this is actually whether we have trust in that or no, this is a very beautiful way to practice because it gives me like a huge view. Mm-hmm. It's like, if you imagine it, it's very huge vow that you will go through so many situations and you will have to face it one by one, that it's so huge that it shrinks time to now. It can take very sharply to this moment. And also it's very nice for me to say this to myself before sitting, because it's just, you have nothing to do than to sit with this vow. So practically, this is for me one way of practicing of using a rebirth as kind of maybe just imagination, whether that's so or no, how to support myself in practice. But my question is how this would work with karma actually, and what would be early Buddhism look at this, because can we actually do this well? So maybe it's rather theoretical, but it's quite interesting for me. Some thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and it's one that, you know, a lot of I have certainly pondered and spoke to a lot of people about it, and a lot of people have thought about this from different perspectives. So if we take the Bodhisattva vow at its most simple and say that the Bodhisattva vow is to practice for the benefit of all beings, to practice awakening for the benefit of all beings, full, complete awakening, just like a Buddha, then you wouldn't come back forever. You would come back for a very, very, very long time, and then you would have this awakening of the same as a Buddha. But the early Buddhist teachings say that everybody, all the arahants, male, female, or whatever other gender might have existed at the time that they didn't write down, had the same awakening as a Buddha. They just had slightly different powers than the Buddha. But the awakening itself is identical. Buddha was very clear about that. When we wake up to the same reality. It would be impossible for us to wake up to something different than the last one who actually woke up. So then the karma of the practice, so if we understand it that way, then we say, okay, the karma of the practice has been developing, and part of the practice that we're doing is clarifying how that process works to the point where there would be this penetrating insight into our absolute integration with the process itself. And so then we can't actually resist it. We wouldn't create positive karma and we wouldn't create negative karma. We would be absolutely in harmony with it because we absolutely understand it, right? So in that case, then you step off the wheel, right? Because you're not creating karma. So that's why even a bodhisattva would never come back forever and ever and ever, because their karma won't let them. If you have that penetrating insight such that there's that absolute harmony, right, then you don't. Then it comes up the question of the vow. So I had this excellent conversation with Hozan the other day, the vice abbot of Berkeley Zen Center, around exactly this. So could the vow override that, such that when you had the awakening of the Buddha, you would override that process of being so completely in harmony with the karma that you would still create some. Even though you completely understood it, you would intentionally create some. So I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know. For me, it's kind of like I let the cards fall where they may. Because the way that I understand it is, if I were, and may it be so, to totally awaken with the same awakening as a Buddha, then that benefits all beings. By definition, it benefits all beings. Because it's like a ripple, right? Because anything that I come into contact with at that point is then being influenced. In the same way that the Buddha 2,600 years ago is influencing me, somebody who could never, ever see him in person, right? And that ripple is still happening. The ripple of the Buddha of our era is still happening. So that's a long way of saying we won't know until we get there, right? But I think that it's the common mistake that happens, and I will point this out also, the common mistake that happens is this understanding that the Bodhisattva comes back only after the Bodhisattva comes off the wheel only after everybody else, and that would be never. And I think that's a mistake. That's saying that you can give the karma of your path away and that you would never reach the culmination, actually. And that I don't think that karma works that way. You cannot give your karma away. The Buddha categorically said, you cannot give your karma away. You can't actually even share your karma, right? You can dedicate your karma to some people, but that's like I say, if we think of karma as being like a light. So I light my candle, by doing the practice, and then I have this little light of Kama, and I say, I dedicate this light to Michaela, and Michaela could see this light and share this light, but I still have the candle. I can't give you the candle. That, from a comic perspective, I can't give you that candle.
Thank you. You mentioned a couple of points. I know this can't be answered, like, yeah, we know, but you mentioned a couple of like contrasts.
And there's a very good book by Venerable Analayo that talks about the contrast between the early Buddhist conception of the Bodhisattva, because the Buddha referred to himself as a Bodhisattva over and over again. The early Buddhist definition of that, and then the later sort of ways that it became understood. So you could look it up. I'll send you the title.
Okay.
And also, just to say on that note, Diamond Sutra, so the links to the Diamond Sutra class and the texts, if for folks who were asking about that last week, they're up under the week 3. So you can find them under week 3.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye-bye. Be well. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. We'll talk about emptiness next time. Another big one.